Bonjour à tous.
All right, hello everyone, and thank you very much for being here today for our webinar. It's the end of July. It's a very important theme. So the interpreter cannot hear the speaker at all.
De dollars de TTS et le sommet avait affirmé sa détermination de voir l'impact de cette allocation accrue par les contributions finances volontaires que les pays riches pourraient.
So the voluntary contributions that rich countries may provide via SDRs, via maybe complementary options via the FMI, the IMF. The connection is pretty terrible. The interpreter is really sorry, but this is making my work very hard. Large negotiations are ongoing on that theme. They have both technical and political dimensions. We do have a very ambitious plan that is currently being elaborated, and there is a deep crisis especially for low and middle income countries. But this crisis is also an occasion, an opportunity to innovate in the architecture of the international funding of development in order to make it more fair and more efficient. So such a meeting as the one we hold today is very important. I think the title is very important. We need to use the SDRs properly. We need to start from the needs of vulnerable countries specifically, and we need to consider their relative vulnerability. And it is this wish to take into account this vulnerability that needs to guide the choice of means, the choice of channels, the choice of modalities via which SDRs on this voluntary basis will be reallocated. So I would like to thank the CGDev for accepting to organize this meeting with us today. Thank you very much, Masoud. And thank you one and all for coming as well. I would just like to also excuse Roger Rigobert Andemi, who's the Minister of Finances of Congo, who had a health problem and had to interrupt his activity for 48 hours and had to go do some medical tests. He had therefore he wasn't able to be with us today. I had him on the phone this morning and he told me that he was really very sorry. I think he had a lot of ideas, very important, very interesting ideas to communicate to us. I hope maybe those ideas will pop up nonetheless during the course of the meeting. I think I've been too long already. I know it's very important for us to listen to all of the voices that are present today, and I'm expecting a great debate about that fundamental theme. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Patrick. Hello and welcome, one and all. Hello to everyone who joined, also online. If you do not mind, I shall now continue in English.
Everyone to this webinar. As Patrick was just explaining, I'm sorry a little bit for the sound at the beginning, but I think it improved, at least as far as I could hear. As Patrick was explaining, this is a very timely discussion because the broad agreement on the $650 billion emission of new SDRs is there. The issue now is that 2/3 of that emission actually goes to countries that don't have an immediate need for it. The low-income countries only get about 3%, Africa gets about 30%, emerging markets and other developing countries between them get somewhere close to 1/3, and they could very well use more for liquidity and for development. And the question is, are there ways in which one could channel some of the SDRs from countries that don't have immediate need for them which is all the if you like, the higher income countries, and are there ways in which that could be reallocated? So the G20 finance ministers governors, their last meeting, I believe, asked the IMF staff to come up with proposals and ideas that they could consider, and the IMF staff have been diligently working away on this, and under the leadership of Uma Ramakrishnan, who is a deputy director in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department of the IMF. She and her colleagues from different parts of the IMF have been busy coming up with proposals. They had an initial discussion, I believe, in their board. And so this is a very good time for Uma to start us off by giving us a view of sort of where do things stand? What are the ideas that are on the table? Which directions are we going? And the questions are self-evident, you know, how much, where to, for what purpose, which countries, etc., etc. And then we have some very distinguished panelists who are going to provide their perspective and react a little bit to what Uma will start us off with. We're going to go first to Bruno Capriac, who is, of course, at the Banque de France, but also a senior fellow at Ferdi. Then we go to Madame Hassatou Nsele, Madame Hassatou Diop Nsele, who is the treasurer at the African Development Bank. And I do think it's very important to bring in a sort of regional perspective, but also a multilateral development bank perspective on this at the same time. Then we go to Remy Rieu, and Remy, of course, wears many hats, but today the two particularly important are not just from his role as the head of AFJ, but also from the IDFC, the group that brings together the development finance community. And Remy, of course, has been the animator of these very important finance in common gatherings, which have been trying to bring together different parts of the international financial and development system. So I think it'd be nice to get that. And then finally, we go to Marc Plant, my colleague at CGD. Marc has been, if you like, our go-to person on SDRs and where they are and where they're going. And so Marc is going to bring us that perspective as well. So that's a little bit of the plan, and we get questions from all of you who are online. Please do send them through the different channels, either through Twitter, through YouTube, through the CGD direct feed, and whichever way you send them, we will try to collect them, and I will then attempt to pass them on to our panelists for their reactions. That's the plan of action. And with that, what I'd like to do now is to turn it over to Uma to give us the sense of where we stand and get the conversation started. So thank you, Uma, for being with us, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Masood, for that introduction. And it is a privilege to be in this esteemed panel. And I thank you for the invitation to talk about SDR channeling. As you just noted, there will soon be a historic $650 billion general SDR allocation to boost global reserves of all IMF member countries, according to their respective quota shares in the IMF. And just over 42% will be allocated to emerging market and developing countries, and of which low-income countries will receive about 21 billion. Now, in this context, many shareholders with strong external positions are interested in voluntarily reallocating, or what we are calling as channeling, at least some of their SDRs to support poorer and more vulnerable countries to recover from the pandemic. The idea is to magnify the impact of the SDR allocation to support recovery and also to support critical global public policy goals. Now, as we know, the pandemic is causing a divergent economic divergence that we are seeing among the advanced and the poor countries, reflecting some of the pandemic-induced disruptions and the extent of policy support that various countries have been or have not been able to provide. Staff at the fund are examining the IMF's lending toolkit across many dimensions to ensure that our financial support for poorer and vulnerable countries remains fit for purpose in the current environment. On SDR channeling specifically, many ideas have been floating, including supporting low-income countries through the existing Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, what we familiarly know as the PRGT, supporting fragile and conflict states, vaccine financing, climate change, supporting small states, and so on. So staff at the fund have looked at all these different proposals, and we've been doing a lot of internal discussions, and we've held a little series of engagement with various stakeholders, including both potential contributors to a possible, possible countries that may be interested in channeling their SDRs, as well as potential borrowers on how they might see the use for some of these SDRs. And based on the various discussions we've had, we have narrowed down the options to 3. So the 3 broad channeling options that we are currently considering, of which the first one is to channel SDRs into what I just described as the PRGT, which is our flagship lending toolkit for the low-income countries. This is our highest priority and an important component of the comprehensive concessional funding strategy that our board approved in mid-July. And as noted in the paper, which is now in public domain, SDRs can help raise additional PRGT loan resources and can also be lent to the PRGT for generating investment returns to be used for subsidization. Option 2 is to create a new IMF-administered trust, to which I will return momentarily because that's where I want to focus on a little bit. The third option that we are thinking about is a channeling SDRs to prescribed holders of SDRs, including other multilateral development banks or MDBs. We have held a number of discussions to explore this option and have discovered that every institution may have some challenges in how they are able to absorb some of these channeled SDRs. So there's a lot of technical discussion that has to continue in the context of this third option in order to see how best SDRs could be channeled to MDBs. I want to focus on option 2, which is to create a new resilience and sustainability trust, which would be administered by the IMF. From the IMF standpoint, there are some key principles that we would need to consider if we want to create a new trust in the IMF. We will have to ensure consistency with the existing lending framework. We will have to ensure consistency with the IMF's mandate. We will have to ensure broad participation both by lenders and borrowers. The new trust would have to provide some form of additionality to the existing toolkit in order to prevent duplication and also to prevent facility shopping by potential borrowers. We would have to find safeguards for the loaned resources. And we will also have to find a proper governance framework and a financial framework with clear rules for decision-making and reporting. So taking into account these principles, let me expand on 3 key questions that we are thinking about in the context of the what I will call RST, in short, for the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. The first question is, why do we need an RST? We see the purpose of the trust as closely related to the dual challenge that many poor countries are facing today, which is recovering from the pandemic, while also not falling behind in addressing some of the longer-term structural challenges that many of these countries are facing. Poorer countries, as I said earlier, there's an economic divergence that is happening, and poorer countries have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and many are also facing major threats to their long-term sustainability as a result of long-term challenges, including things like climate change. And if these challenges are left unaddressed, these vulnerabilities could jeopardize future balance of payments stability. A key reason why many of these countries have not been able to address these long-term vulnerabilities is the lack of affordable long-term financing, which is now aggravated by the burdens that have been imposed by the pandemic. The desire by the richer countries or the advanced countries to channel some of the SDRs that are going to be allocated to them creates an opportunity to facilitate longer-term structural transformation at a time when financing is particularly scarce and policy space is limited for many of these poorer and vulnerable countries. Such lending would be intended to complement the medium-term financing from the IMF's own core lending toolkit, as well as complement the project lending and the development financing that is typically done by the multilateral development banks or the MDBs. Thus, in line with our mandate, with the fund's mandate, the RST could help address actual and potential balance of payments needs or protracted balance of payments problems, or the additional dimension that long-term financing will support is prospective balance of payment stability that may be associated with the recovery from the pandemic and longer-term resilience building and structural transformation. The second question relates to the perimeter of eligibility, which is something that we have got a lot of interest in, who exactly would be eligible for this RST. The intention here from our standpoint, and this is an engagement that is ongoing, the idea would be to cover both low-income countries and vulnerable middle-income countries. The precise eligibility criteria and where exactly to draw the line in terms of who would be eligible or not for this RST is still work in progress. We are engaging with stakeholders to understand better how to think about this, what would be the factors that would play into defining this eligibility criterion. And in addition to eligibility, we are also thinking there would be a qualification for accessing funds from the RST. And that could be determined by the alignment of the borrower's policy reform commitments to the purposes of the trust. The third question is, how's the RST or this new trust that we are thinking about, how would it be different from a development facility? A critical design feature that we are considering is that lending from the RST would be for supporting policy reforms to the trust's objectives or the purposes of the trust, rather than to project lending or development financing. And that way, we are linking the support from the RST to macro-critical policies and balance of payments needs. And that is a way for us to differentiate ourselves from development financing that is typically associated with multilateral development banks. So the intent would be to complement rather than substitute MDB financing. Moreover, the financing needs of countries to address these structural reforms are so big that we can at best only complement what is already available, what is needed for countries, and we can in no way provide the entire financing that would be needed to address some of these very long-standing reforms. So we would hope that we are able to catalyze, which is part of our role in the international financing architecture, to be able to catalyze financing that would be needed for some of this longer-term financing also. And we fully expect to work in full cooperation and collaboration with our partners, the other multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, to be able to leverage and draw on their expertise and experience. Before I close, I want to touch on something very important, because there is, there's this notion that SDR allocation is happening and SDR reallocation or the channeling is simply a transfer from the advanced countries to the other countries that may be in more need of these resources. But I want to give some context for why it is not that simple, and to provide some little explanation for the complexities that are associated with channeling SDRs in the context of setting up a new IMF administered trust. Now, the first thing is the SDR channeling is a completely voluntary process, and potential contributors have to be satisfied, and they all have to agree on how their SDRs are going to be used. Second, many lenders who are going to channel their SDRs may require that their loaned SDRs continue to be treated as reserve assets, which would require that adequate risk protection, credit risk protection, be available in order to manage possible risks that might arise from lending from this trust. And it would also require, the reserve asset status would also require that we ensure liquidity, or what we call encashability of the loan resources that the contributors provide, so that they have access to these resources should a need arise for them. A multi-layered credit risk management framework will therefore need to be put in place with appropriate policy safeguards and financial buffers. We have a structure that is in place for the PRGT, and we'll have to think about how to do something like that for this new trust that we are thinking about. And creating the necessary financial structure for a new trust that meets these features will take a lot of time. And we are now just in the very early stages of discussing some of these issues, and we will have to continue dialogue with the potential contributors to ensure that the criteria that they need in order to maintain some of these features are, we are able to provide in the context of this trust. And the third element that I also want to talk about is the SDRs that are provided to borrowing members need to be converted to freely usable currencies. SDRs cannot be, it's not a trade, I cannot go buy a coffee with SDRs. I would need to convert it to a freely usable currency like the dollar or the euro, or one of those internationally accepted freely usable currencies. So, and this typically takes place through the voluntary trading agreements that are in place for SDRs. And we would need to further engage because we would be increasing the volume of those trading agreements. How exactly do we go about that is another question that we would need to carefully consider in the context of setting up a new trust. So it is not that straightforward, and we are in early stages. The engagement is ongoing. We have had our first discussions with the board, and we expect that we would have several more. Let me stop there because that's a brief overview, and let me turn it back to you, Masood, and I'll be happy to take any questions that may come along. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Uma. That was really helpful. It gives a very nice overview, and I'm sure it'll trigger a number of questions that people will come back to you with. Let me just put two, which I'm sure will come to you, which, one is how much money are we talking about here for this RST? And the second is, you said it would take some time. I think it would be good to sort of see if you have a sense of what are we talking about, few months, more than a few months. I'm sure there'll be other questions as well. My dream, of course, is that there will come a time when we will be able to buy coffee, at least in the IMF cafeteria with SDRs, but clearly we are not there yet. So let me turn to Bruno, who is our first panelist. Bruno, you heard Uma, we have a framework. How do you react to that?
Allow me to switch to French. Merci beaucoup, Masoud. Merci beaucoup au CGDEV.
Thank you very much, Masoud. Thank you, CGD and the IMF to have invited me to this webinar with prestigious panelists. I will start my presentation by answering your first question. How much money are we talking about for this SDR? Potentially, it would be the entire amount and not only the last allocation of SDRs. And as Uma said, about 2/3 of these SDRs go to countries which will not use them because they don't need them, especially countries which are issuing currencies which are freely usable. So potentially, we're talking about 400 billion SDRs. This is a very high amount if you compare it with the public development aids. I mean, going to developing countries and coming from countries, which is it's about 3.5 years of public aid to development and more than 10 years of public aid to development to countries which are in a critical situation. It's also a very high amount if you compare it with the needs which have been estimated to finish the vaccination campaign globally, about 35 billion SDR, as assessed by the IMF, or what we need to ensure the resilience of health systems by the high panel, which was set up by the Italian presidency of the G20, about 50 billion SDRs. But this is also an amount which by nature is quite limited compared to other dimensions. The reallocation potential corresponds to about one quarter of the French GDP. And we know that part of this potential is not going to be used. For example, at the G7 summit, they committed in 100 billion, so much lower to the reallocation potential. So this amount is both quite high, especially if you compare to the public development aids, but still limited in its scope. So in my opinion, my suggestion would be the following. First of all, we have a lot of ideas to use this money, as Uma said. And of course, maybe we would need to limit the number of potential users and try to channel them through multilateral channels or through a limited number of multilateral channels instead of having uncoordinated bilateral agreements. So I would say we need to really focus the reallocation. But we also need to have enough options to maximize the contribution, because as Uma said, these are voluntary contributions. So we need to satisfy also the needs of the contributors. Second, we need to target the use of these SDRs, where reallocation of SDR may change the situation instead of being additional resources which could replace other resources. And finally, a third idea would be to maximize the leverage effect on private equity as well as public equity. Second thought I wanted to share with you, we need to make sure that everybody knows that these resources are expensive resources. SDR, this is bears an interest rate, which is the SDR interest rate. So if we use these SDRs, it means debts at a level because of the market situation. The debt level is probably higher than what the World Bank could get for average times. On these SDRs, there is also an exchange rate risk. And finally, and Uma mentioned it as well, we need to attract voluntary contribution of some countries which must keep the SDR reserves. We need to take prudential measures to ensure liquidity and the risk of counterpart of these SDRs, which are actually allocated. So these SDRs are expensive resources. So three conclusions. These SDRs cannot replace concessional resources. Second, we need additional concessional resources to lower the cost of resources for eligible countries, especially for countries which are eligible to concessional financing, whether IMF or concessional of a multilateral development bank. So just like in the case of the RGT, we need to find concessional resources to lower the cost of these SDRs. And finally, a very important point, we also need to look into the absorption capacity and the sustainability of the debts of these the countries we are allocating the SDRs to, because as I said, these are relatively expensive resources, especially for countries with low income. Third and last reflection, whom should benefit from this SDRs and why? As Uma said, it is obvious that the spirit of this reallocation is to reallocate based on the needs. And this reallocation will depend on the channels we use. If we use multilateral development banks, especially the concessional, we will end up with the usual allocation measures. If it's through IMF, again, we will have an allocation which will depend on the quota. And finally, it will depend on the objective of the reallocation. If we want to finance an instrument against vulnerabilities with different allocation logics, which are different from the World Bank and the IMF, then we will have a reallocation formula which are going to be focused on these vulnerabilities, whether global vulnerabilities or specific vulnerabilities. And these funds may also be used as for transversal funding of world public assets, because we know now that we need a new form of governance. And so behind this governance, we need operational tools to manage global public assets. But I think, as Uma said, this is an opportunity to tackle an issue which is quite old, but which is quite concerning after this crisis, which is to make sure that a country can recover from a shock, can increase its resilience, and by the same token, ensure the stability of development strategy. So these or helping against vulnerability, this is maybe an opportunity for this SDR reallocation to improve the situation. And we could even consider mixing two different users I just mentioned. To fund vulnerabilities or an instrument against vulnerabilities, and to manage world public goods, for example, through the funding, if we use the channel of the trust fund of the PRGT, through reforms of this trust fund and of this fund allocation of this trust fund, especially with vulnerability criteria, for example, based on climate changes or on the pandemic. And last point is conditionality. The SDR is a non-conditional instrument, but it's difficult to believe that reallocation can be done without any condition, especially to avoid arbitration with conditional facilities, whether through IMF or channel, but also because of the countries sharing their SDRs, and some of these countries are
donc cette conditionnalité, elle va évidemment dépendre.
demanding this conditionality. So of course it will depend on the channel we decide to use, multilateral development banks or IMF, but it will also depend on the final objective of this reallocation. What do we want to do with these SDRs? And this is where we will have to avoid a double conditionality, which would be too heavy a burden. So we will have to innovate. Thank you very much, Bruno, for your presentation.
I'll turn now to Madame Nsele. I think Uma talked about the third. She put on the table the third option, which is to try and use the multilateral development banks, the other holders of prescribed holders of SDRs. And I wanted to get a little bit, you're the treasurer, you're sitting inside a development bank. How do you see that possibility? Is it realistic? Is it something that is part of your vision of how the multilateral development banks can develop? So your thoughts, please, now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Masood, and good day to all. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and having this discussion, with such distinguished panelists. And my thanks to both the Ferdi and CDDEF for this invitation. So absolutely, I think that the Multilateral Development Bank can play a role and should be playing a role. The multilateral development banks, we have the entities that goes and fund themselves in capital markets, and they also have the soft non-lending arm, and both can have a role to play in order to maximize the impact of this allocation. As you know, outside of Africa, governments have been collectively pouring trillions of dollars into their economies to safeguard the lives and the livelihoods of their citizens affected by the crisis. And in contrast, the fiscal and financial policy actions of African governments have been muted because of their limited financial capacity. So while official institutions, MDBs, including the African Development Bank Group, have provided much needed support, assisting middle income, low income, and fragile countries to deal with the challenges brought by the pandemic, and also the various actions taken by the international community have all provided much needed breathing space, but it's not enough. And this allocation will help developing economies meet some of their most immediate health, social, and also economic needs. So it is a very powerful tool that has been unleashed by the International Monetary Fund, and countries in Africa need to make the most of it. So indeed, as was said, the 54 countries of Africa are going to receive $33 billion dollars in SDRs. The G7 economies will receive about $283 billion in order to supplement that $2.5 trillion of reserves. So recycling a portion of the general SDR allocation from advanced economies to the low income and most vulnerable countries is the right thing to do. And it's the right decision that has been taken by the G20. We estimate that over the next 3 years, African countries, African governments will require additional financing of about $485 billion in order to respond to the crisis. So Africa, as you know, is facing threats on multiple fronts: the COVID pandemic, the effects of climate change, which is leading to frequent and drought, flooding, displacement of people, food and water insecurity, and a huge infrastructure gap. So there is no surprise, for example, and I was staggered by the numbers when I learned that the continent holds 15% of the world's population and accounts for 60% of global deaths due to infectious and disease. So making available a portion of the SDR MDBs, which is the third option that has been outlined, highlighted by the IMF, by UMA, would significantly magnify the impact of the IMF initiative, and in a very meaningful manner. So MDBs, like, for example, the African Development Bank, can leverage their SDR allocation 3 to 4 times, and therefore deploy SDR at a multiple. So, and MDBs can also invest them relatively quickly and effectively in sustainable job-creating transformative projects. For example, $50 billion allocated to MDBs is about $150 to $200 billion in development financing that can be deployed by MDBs. And furthermore, thanks to that AAA rating and also their capital market strength, MDB offers long-term loans at levels that are far more attractive than what African countries, for example, can possibly obtain on their own through commercial financing. So, for example, since 2010, about $110 billion worth of bonds were issued by 12 African countries eligible to borrow from the African Development Bank. And we estimated that almost $56 billion of interest could have been theoretically saved had those countries had access to resources from the bank for similar amounts. So you see already the impact in terms of debt sustainability. So the African Development Bank as well and other MDBs can play a key role in strengthening the balance sheet of African public development banks, and something that is very close Remy Rio's heart, I'm sure. And this will allow those public development banks to channel liquidity and investment financing into well-structured, sustainable, and inclusive development projects. Strengthening their balance sheet is really key to catalyzing their contributions to economic development. So there is also climate change, which undoubtedly should be a key priority with regards to what the SDR should finance. And as you all know, Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change impact and is actually expected to be the hardest hit. So we need substantial resources to finance both our climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. But the cost, again, is high. It is estimated to be about $30 billion per year by 2030. So MDBs have the experience, they have the expertise, they have the ecosystem needed in order to be able to deliver the sustainable high development impact investment. So your question, Masoud, how should it be deployed or redirected to MDBs? So that recycling can be done through either donations, and I understand that it has never been done before, and I understand that there is not much appetite for that because advanced economies do want to benefit from the reserve asset status of the SDR, as indicated by Uma. So the recycling can also be done through loans that will need to be structured to be accounted for as equity from both an accounting and rating agency's perspective, somewhat similar to what is done with a hybrid capital instrument. And we will need also to explore mechanisms similar maybe to those of the IMF PRGT in order to provide the necessary liquidity to the loans so that the SDR resources can retain their classification as reserve assets. And this will truly maximize the benefits and impact of the new SDR allocation while complementing other initiatives such as the PRGT and the resolution fund that Oma described. So we are working on those proposals, and we hope we will reach out, obviously, to the International Monetary Fund and to other partners in order to be able to truly maximize the benefit and impact of this allocation. And funding can also be done through our concessional lending arm, the African Development Fund. The World Bank has IDA, and also those will need to be structured for the concessional lending arm in size. And this would mean greater support to the neediest countries in Africa with commensurate development results. And Bruno Cabriac has outlined the main challenges faced by the soft loan windows, structuring cost, currency, and also they don't have the same leveraging capacity. But today, there is a unique opportunity to massively help address the critical challenges faced by the world's most vulnerable countries, and at a cost that is palatable. So the proposal to channel this via MDB, is one that we support. France has taken and that has called on the world advanced economies to redirect $100 billion of the new SDR allocation into Africa. And we do hope that for the sake of Africa, that this call from France, endorsed by Africans, will be heard and that we will not be left behind.
Thank you very much, Hassan. That's a passionate call for reallocating where it's most needed. And I think just to be clear for people who are listening, the multiplier that you were talking about, that if you get 3 or 4 or 5 times, that comes from providing these resources as part of equity and capital, which then allows you to leverage that capital from a loan to equity ratio. And so that's how we get the extra multiplier. And I think we will all be looking forward to getting soon the proposal from you and from the MDB community together, probably, in terms of how can that be structured in a way to address some of these trade-offs that you put on the table. So thank you for that. And you ended on the 100 billion call from France at the G7. Of course, Remy's not going to speak on necessarily on that, but I do want to now bring Remy into this conversation. And Remy, can I also ask you perhaps to think not just of the multilateral development banks, but is there a way to bring the national development banks into this conversation as also potential channels? And how could we structure that? Because that's another untapped, if you like, potential contributor to development finance that we could discuss. So over to you, Remy.
Thanks a lot, Masoud. And yes, I'm representing here the IDFC. You mentioned a group of 26 regional and national public development banks. So this is the reason why I will speak in English. Very pleased to be with all of you. Thanks to Patrick and Masoud, CGDev and Ferdi for hosting and inspiring all of us. Thanks to Bruno and Mark. Sorry to miss Roger Andely, a close friend. And we see Uma and Asatu are in charge, which is very good news. I will just, yes, add and maybe complement what Asatu just said and plea for innovation and for the cause of, well, African public development banks, because this is the issue today. The balance of payments needs are crucial, of course, for financial stability and maintaining trade flows in the crisis, and they certainly have to be urgently settled. But it was also made very clear during the crisis that we have to rebuild and rebalance many value chains. See vaccines in Africa, for instance, massively invest in a green economy and social infrastructure, and leave no one behind. Regarding Africa, we know that we have to industrialize the continent and not only restart and replicate the current disbalances. And so this means way more development finance. Maybe a redefinition of what development finance means. It means also way more mobilization of private finance than today in this recovery. And so the issue of SDR, of course, is coming as a unique opportunity. And this is the reason why we're here. I remember it was simply stated by Benedicto Rama. He's the CEO of Afreximbank. He said, do we continue to use SDR to finance import from Asia? Or do we invest now to reduce the risk of a future balance of payment crisis linked to trade? So this is, and Asatu made it clear, this is what we heard from African leaders and what they're asking for to make an innovative use of these resources. We made a proposal last November, Masoud, you reminded it, with this Finance in Common Summit movement. It was the first gathering of the 500 public development banks in the world. Yes, the multilateral, of course, leading, but also all the others, regional, national, sub-national, deeply rooted in their constituencies, amounting to, well, more than 10% of global investments, and willing to turn to SDGs and structure as a global architecture for public investments. Many leaders were there, including the UN Secretary General, Kristalina Georgieva was there, President Adesina, paying attention. And the key role of African public development banks was very present, and also specifically highlighted last May, when you remember President Macron hosted a summit on the financing of African economies in Paris. where African PDBs expressed very strong willingness to contribute. Their specific role is written down in the conclusions of the summit. There was even an op-ed signed afterwards by many European and African leaders proposing exactly what we're talking about today. That's part of the newly issued SDRs be transformed, recycled to increase the financial capacities of these institutions. So I was in a room and the point was made very clear. And for good reasons, of course. Development banks, as we all know, are key instruments in the recovery. They can bridge between the governments and the private sector, between the global liquidity and concrete action, between short-term urgencies and long-term priorities. They are the institutions able to originate more quality investments opportunities for existing liquidity. They can intermediate between investors, public and private. They can support the green economy, and if properly governed, of course, they can borrow debt without increasing the government's situation. And we know this is a huge challenge in Africa. And so it was a moment where we all paid attention and promised support to the network of African public development banks behind their regional multilateral platforms, the African Development Bank. And President Adesina was very eloquent on this, but also with a lot of institutions, and that are very innovative, just mentioning BOAD, TDB, again, Afrexim Bank and others. So that's the context, the ambition. And of course, if I turn now to the technicalities and try to imagine through which channel could SDRs reach the public development banks, maybe three ideas. You said that, of course, most of the allocation will be managed by the IMF, of course, for good reasons. But there were decisions in the past allowing other institutions to be prescribed holders of SDRs, including, as Setu was referring to, the African Development Bank.
I think we just seem to have temporarily lost Remy. Let's see if he's having difficulty connecting. Maybe Remy will reconnect in a minute and we'll bring him back in. While we do that, I don't want to hold us up. Let me take advantage just of this break. We'll come back and let Remy finish his point when he rejoins. But a couple of questions that have come up, which are more questions of getting more information, that I might turn to you, Uma, first. And I think they really fall into the following categories. One is will this resilience and sustainability trust, if you had borrowed from that, would you also need to have a regular IMF program alongside? Would that be a condition, like a standby or an EFF or the equivalent for low-income countries? And if not, would you need some kind of a climate or health program if you're supporting that? And who would assess that? So, would the fund now take a view, which then links it also to the conditionality? Would the conditionality be associated? Remy, I was just posing a question to Uma since we had lost you, but I'll come back to you in 1 second, if you permit, just to pose the question to Uma, and then we'll come to you, and then she can answer later. Uma, as I was just saying, what is the conditionality? Is it going to be linked to governance? And the final question also is, how long would this money be lent for? Because the fund generally has had a sort of 10-year outer limit on its consistent with its monetary character. And are we thinking now of 15 or 20-year loans? How do you make that work? So let me park those questions of information with you and come back to Rami, hoping that the connection now works to complete what you were saying. I mean, you were, at least on my screen, Rami has disappeared again. So Rami, are you there without the video or? No,
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So maybe without the video.
Yes, I keep the video switched off.
Okay.
And I'm sorry for that. I'm in my countryside, so it's a bit sketchy.
No,
I was
we
just
envy you.
I think I was disconnected when I started exploring maybe three options that
exactly
could be discussed. The first one was since the African Development Bank is already a prescribed holder of SDR, try to see if we could set up I would say a financing common trust fund, a facility mirroring the PRGT mechanism regarding subsidy and reserve account, able to complement the resources that the AFDB is raising on the market and deployed through the network of its African peers that have, of course, a very strong interest in SDR resources because they are expensive. Bruno is right compared to AAA issuance, but at what price these institutions are financing themselves for now. So if we could find through their multilateral platform, which is the African Development Bank, a way to reach these local public banks, it could be cheaper, of course, than what they are providing today. The second option could be to imagine, well, I will also call it a finance in common. The IMF is proposing. Maybe the channel would be then to grant long-term loans to MDBs and specifically to the African Development Bank. Ideally, if these resources could have the conditions of a loan mirroring the requirements of tier 2 financing, as Asatu was referring to, so that it could be considered as quasi-equity for the African Development Bank and carry this leverage impact of around 4. This increased capitalization would allow AFDB to again to expand its operation with and through African PDBs. Of course, I know the innovation that is behind it for the IMF and its members, but with this scheme, the loan could be used, transformed into development finance, and maybe provide the leverage. We are all searching for our own leverage with our financing capacities as PDBs, and of course, the leverage on private finance. Last, we could maybe also work directly with willing African central banks. I mean, the institutions, the central banks that will benefit from the allocation, the PRGT, the RST loans. Maybe these institutions could set up, if of course allowed by their regulation, special mechanisms to redirect excess liquidity toward a new high-quality local asset class to stimulate African bond markets and notably the role of public development banks. In terms of conditions and eligibility, I would see, of course, as the host of Finance in Common, a great advantage to have incentives to strengthen these financial institutions with criteria on governance, risk management, and cooperations between them. And of course, try to orient these resources towards poor countries as much as possible. I close by saying that by thanking the IMF, of course, for providing, imagining this multilateral framework that is most needed, and for the three options its board discussed last Friday. Strengthening PRGT and creating the resilience and sustainability trust are of course most welcome. I invite to further work on option 3, I mean the channel through MDBs, but I hope that it will stay alive since the 3 options are not mutually exclusive. I know the technical difficulties, they are mostly linked to what Bruno reminded us, the preservation of the reserve asset nature of SDR, liquidity and risk management. And there could be other ways, of course, to strengthen the balance sheet of public development banks. But my guess is that if we do not invent something at the heart of this crisis, I'm convinced we will regret it dearly in the coming months. And I clearly heard African leaders pleading for new approaches through the use of SDR. And I remind all of you that there are some schemes existing to put SDR to use for development finance. This is the way Afrexim Bank again will certainly be recapitalized, especially to finance the AVAT platform for the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines. So we are ready as the collective of PDBs to participate in this discussion and willing to receive stronger and more ambitious mandates. Just informing you that the second edition of the Financing Commons Summit will take place the 3rd week of October, 19th and 20th, hosted by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti and as part of the Italian presidency of the G20. So it's positioned immediately after the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in DC and before the Leaders Summit and the COP26. So maybe it's a good timing, occasion to move forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you for putting some of those specific ideas on the table as well, and for giving us the upcoming dates for the second edition of the Finance and Commons Summit. Mark, could I turn to you now to sort of listen to all the different perspectives? You've been thinking long and hard about this, so what's your takeaways from this?
Thank you, Masoud, and thank you to all the fellow panelists for very interesting interventions. I think, as usual, coming last, one risks repeating what's gone before, but I hope I can summarize a bit and draw a few different points out for our audience. I think, first of all, I'd like to step back before the allocation, the new allocation that will take place, or sorry, before the reallocation, look at the allocation that will take place in August. This can be a very important source of resources for many countries, although it varies particularly in Africa. In Liberia, for example, the new SDRs will amount to over 10% of GDP. In Zambia, it'll be just about 2.5% of GDP. In the Republic of Congo, about 1.7% of GDP, while in Cameroon is less than 1% of GDP. But nonetheless, this substantial influx of resources needs preparation. Ministers of Finance and central bank governors need to think about what they're going to do as these funds arrive in their accounts. They can be used to bolster reserves, to repay debt to some institutions or bilateral partners, or as a needed source of foreign exchange for imports. But like any infusion of resources from outside, the SDRs need to be well managed in the context of an overall fiscal and monetary plan, particularly when they're large relative to GDP. And I think the important thing now is there's going to be increased scrutiny on their use from the international community. We all agree this is an important experiment going forward. And if the global community is to see this as a success, countries will have to show how they use their SDRs and to what effect. And I think the world spotlight is on the countries and on all of us who have urged the use of SDRs. So transparency is necessary, but good planning and thoughtfulness in their use will be very important for this grand experiment to be a success. For my second point, let me turn to the issue of reallocation or recycling as different people call it. In the options presented by today's panelists and by others, there's a tension between impact and speed. Reserve assets are meant to serve two related purposes. They're a signal of economic probity. When a country's reserves start running low, it's a clear indication that there are problems. And they're also a buffer against unexpected shocks. So reserves need to be both patient and available. And there are two strands of the conversation we're having today: address the immediate liquidity and fiscal concerns brought about by COVID, but provide the patient resources needed for a transition to a green and equitable global economy. Those are the two concerns that are confronting the global community today. I think the IMF is well suited to assist in the shorter term economic management functions. And it makes sense to bolster their facilities to get countries help in countries who are in immediate need of help. This can be done quickly through its own balance sheet, which could be better used, and it can be done through the reallocation schemes that UMA has put forward today. Where I think there's more of a question is if and how to use the SDRs for a green transition. Is the IMF really the right institution to provide economic and financial framing? The attraction of the IMF is that, given all the technical problems of mobilizing SDRs that we've talked about today, the IMF is the fastest way of getting some resources in place. And as many have noted, it can preserve the so-called reserve asset characteristic of the SDR, which the G7 and the G20 have strongly encouraged. But there's the question, does it have the needed expertise, the right operational time horizon, and the appropriate instruments to make sure green financing is used well that will lead to a sustainable and equitable global economy? Clearly, this needs deep thinking, not just at the fund, but at other institutions that will be needed as partners as we move forward. The World Bank, the multilateral development banks, and indeed the local development banks. And I'm very heartened to see that everyone today has talked about the need for expansion of this effort beyond the walls of the IMF. If we're indeed to do this transition sensibly, what's needed is a global platform for transition financing. We have to think about how SDRs figure in the overall financial picture of climate and sustainable financing, not just within the walls of the IMF. We're trying to use SDRs very much at this point in our minds as for two sets of problems: the short-term COVID problem and the longer-term sustainability problem. I think we need to think in different ways about those, and the panelists today have offered ideas to do that. My third point is to take a step back and think about what it is that SDRs actually do. As Uma said, they're not money. They can't be used to buy things. They can't buy vaccines. They can't buy a cup of coffee. They're really a way to pool and share global reserves. In essence, through the SDR, member countries of the IMF have agreed that they will make a certain amount of their hard currency available on demand to other countries. For example, if the Congo needs euros, it can go to the IMF and actually ask to exchange its SDRs for another country's available euros. Thus, the real question is how the world should mobilize its global reserves, the entirety of its global reserves, which are held by individual countries, to the benefit of all countries during a moment of crisis. Let's look briefly at the global numbers. Global reserves stand at about $12.5 trillion. With a new allocation, total SDRs will be just under $1 trillion. The old allocation plus the new allocation combined, as Bruno said. So about 8% of global reserves will be in the SDR reserve sharing pool. That is, 8% can be shared among the various countries of the world. The G7 proposes reallocating at most 100 billion of that pool to low and middle income countries. That's just 0.8% of global reserves to assist countries that comprise at least 10% of the global economy and about half of the world's population. Is that really equal to the crisis we face? Without immediate action, COVID risks moving from an acute to a chronic problem in much of the world, especially in Africa. And at the same time, it appears that the tipping points of the climate crisis are much nearer than scientists had thought. Urgent and costly action is needed now for both mitigation and adaptation. 12.5 trillion is sitting in reserves. These reserves aren't idle, but they're sitting in low-risk assets waiting for a rainy day. Aren't we at that rainy day? Can we only share a 0.8% with middle and low-income countries? Shouldn't we think about letting them use, say, 4 times that amount, $400 billion, or 3.2% of global reserves to get through this crisis and prepare for a green and equitable future? It hardly seems a big ask, 3.2%. And we're not asking to spend those reserves. All we have to do, as many panelists have mentioned today, is put them in somewhat riskier assets. Use them to capitalize other institutions that know how to do the type of development and change in economic structure that's needed, to create pools of capital that we can leverage to mobilize more private capital, to use the expertise and management that we have. But I think if the leaders really leaders of the world stick to this mantra of we have to maintain the reserve asset characteristic of the SDR, we're going to stay embroiled in the complex and arcane web of national laws and regulations governing the use of SDRs. And I'm afraid little will happen, and it will happen very slowly. I think these are indeed extraordinary times. And while creating $650 billion worth of SDRs is an extraordinary action, and we should all be thankful for that, we have to figure out how to use them well. Countries will have to use them well right off the bat, the allocations they get. But the SDRs provide a platform for global reserve sharing. We have a pot of money of 12.5 trillion. We've carved out 8% of that and say we're going to share these among the countries of the world to get us out of this pickle, if you will. There are reasonable ideas out there. We've heard lots of them. They're not radical by any means, but they won't happen unless world leaders give some direction to do more than they're doing now. I think we really need to push to take the ideas that we've heard today, to expand on those ideas and offer to, if you will, the finance ministers of the world, ways we can use these SDRs better. The IMF is a good start, but I think we have to do much, much more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Sort of rousing call to arms. So before we conclude or get people to react, I do want to get Uma your answers to some of those information type questions, just so people know what's currently being on the cards. So,
thanks, Masood. Very interesting comments and interesting ideas. So I welcome the discussion. Just to be clear, and Remy emphasized this already, the options are not mutually exclusive. So it depends on what the contributors want to do, and so all options are on the table and all options are feasible, and it is really up to how to make it work and which ones how to sequence, because there are resource demands for creating each of these that go beyond just the SDR resources because of the multi-layered risk framework that is necessary in order to support the reserve asset status and the risk mitigation framework that would be needed to ensure that the loan is safe. So the way we are looking at it, and this is coming to the questions that you raised, Masood, in terms of how are we thinking about the RST itself, whether we will need a regular program along with the accessing the RST or not. In the context of the multi-layer risk framework, for us, policy safeguards is an important layer of that credit risk mitigation. And then there are others, like in the PRGT, we have the reserve account, we have the subsidy account for the concessional side of things. So we have various layers that we need to take into consideration. And in that context, for now, in the creation of a new trust, and this is work in progress, we are nowhere near finalizing what the design should be. And we have to, of course, engage our board and come to a consensus on how we want to go forward. We have to take that feature of policy safeguards into consideration. And a big way in which for us, the policy safeguards are put in place, our quote unquote collateral is conditionality, because we don't get other collateral, so to speak. And so from that standpoint, we would need to think about how to provide that policy safeguard. It could come in the form of a concurrent GRA or PRGT program, which could be associated in order to access the RST, and therefore RST wouldn't become a top-up. That would provide one layer of credit risk mitigation to alleviate the concerns from the G7 or whoever the contributors may be. So that's something that we would need to think about further to see whether a concurrent program is needed, how to frame the conditionality. And, in terms of the conditionality, the RST, unless it is going to be designed as a co-financing instrument, if it is going to be purpose, say for climate or specific purposes that are associated with it, accessing the RST would therefore have to make sure that the qualification ensures that the reforms that are being undertaken are consistent with the frame, with the purposes of the RST. So I think that would be an important consideration in how we design and think about it. So that is another aspect of it. And then how long the lending, the maturity that is associated with the lending. The way we are thinking about it is the toolkit that we have right now supports the medium term. And as you said, Masood, it is up to 10 years. So in order to provide the additionality that we are looking for, if you recall in my original presentation, I said that the trust would have to provide some additionality. What is the extra that this trust will provide to the existing toolkit? The extra that we are thinking of is probably that the maturity should be longer than 10 years. So how far that should go is something that we would need to work out and make sure that we are able to, again, have the risk framework consistent with that maturity also. But at this stage, we are thinking that the lending should probably go beyond the current outer limit, which is 10 years. So probably go beyond that. But again, there's a lot of simulation and numerical work that will have to go into this to determine, how far out we are able to do that. I can stop there, Masood.
Thank you very much. We've got 10 minutes. So I wanted to just ask all the panelists, you've listened to what others have said. And is there anything that you wanted to come back on quickly? And is there anything that you wanted to share at this point? Anyone? Bruno?
Yes. I think we focused maybe too much on the channel. And not enough on what we are going, as Uma has just said, what we are going to provide in terms of innovation on how we are doing things and what we are doing, in fact, and to provide additionality. So I think the IMF is trying to provide additionality through its new trust funds, through also the reform of the PRGT, which is good. Maybe it would be better to open a little bit more the box, but this is a try. And if I had something to say about what Remy and Asatu said, it's maybe to provide us with what they want to do and what they can provide in terms of additionality and not business as usual in using these SDR.
Thank you very much, Bruno. So actually, that's a very good point that you've just put on the table. There is, somebody once said to me, which is a phrase that has stuck with me for a long time, which is plan beats no plan. And basically, even if the important thing, it seems to me, is that on the other side, which is not the IMF's own business, for which they're developing the ideas on PRGT, on this RST, if you take all the development banks and start thinking about what is the plan at the moment for how the MDBs, the regional development banks, national development banks will come together and put on the table an ambitious plan which could then do exactly the sorts of long-term structural transformation support that is needed, that is commensurate a bit with the size of the challenge that Mark put on the table also, that might help us to raise the level of ambition amongst those who are ultimately making the decisions. And I wanted to get a little bit of a sense from Asatu and Remy, perhaps, on, is that something that you see happening? Is the Finance in Commons Summit, in a way, the opportunity for the development banking community to put on the table kind of proposal that would be if you think of it as the resilience and sustainability trust mirror for the development banking community rather than for the IMF side. And any reactions to that? Asatu.
Yes, if I may. So thank you very much. So with regards to your first question, what it is that we need to bring to, for additionality, etc. And I'm talking for Africa. Africa faces.
Peut-être, Massoud,
Pardon, Patrick, oui.
Ce serait intéressant que Uma aussi revienne.
Masoud, it would be interesting also if Uma could come back to that problem of the necessary time, because we do feel that there are short-term goals, emergency goals, but we can also see that there are conditions. We need reaffectations, channels, relays, and so on and so forth. So how can we use this instrument to face the current emergencies? Absolutely, yes. Do we speak of like two horizons, one parallel to the other? To what extent can SDRs be useful to also respond to both immediate and long-term needs? It's true. I will maybe first leave the floor to Hasetu.
It's not about the first question was, how can MDBs bring additionality and so forth? With regards to Africa, Africa faces critical challenges that have not been resolved. For Africa today, it's about resources 1, resources 2, and resources 3. How do we attract more resources into the continent, whatever ways, in order to attain our development objectives? The mandate of the African Development Bank for Africa is the same, I think, that the mandate that the World Bank would have for Africa and the world, about social and economic development. And what has been lacking have been the resources. And we've been trying to find, various innovative way to attract resources. So what we have, for example, if I look at the African Development Bank, what we have is a drop in the ocean of needs. And it's about, how to channel more into the continent. And when I hear about, building back greener and better, it's good. But in Africa, sometimes it's not about building back, it's about building. So, but the financing in common is in my view, a very innovative idea, because it is a way for bringing together a lot of continental actors that are all geared towards the same development objectives. If I take the African Development Bank, we are shareholders, we're at equity investments in the likes of the East African Development Bank, in the regional DFIs for Africa. Why? Because they are a way of furthering our own social and economic development objectives. And with regards to the length of the maturity, etc. So the type of lending that we do is, for sovereign type of loans, about 20 years. For private sector, we go up to 15 years. We can even go a bit further, I think, for this. And we have the ecosystem. We are ready. I mean, we are operating. What we just need is more resources in order to be able to attain our objective and the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Asatu. Remy, was there anything you wanted to add on this point before I come back to Uma, both for when it might all come together? That was sort of Patrick's reminder on that, but also Uma, I think on the amounts. I think we haven't yet. It'd be useful to get a bit more clarity on that. So, Remy.
Oui, merci Massoud. Je vais passer au français.
Yes, thank you, Massoud. I will actually answer the questions in French. What we offer with Hassatu is, well, I don't think we're offering business as usual at all. I respect and support and believe in multilateralism. Multilateral messages are key. We have to reinforce multilateralism so that we may provide emergency resources, so that we may provide the right incentives, but the multilateral system will remain of a modest size. And what we have written in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement is that it is the whole financial system that needs to be transformed. So we must find a way to reach to reach the $3,000 billion, the $3 trillion that all of the public banks are funding every year to improve the quality of this funding, and to give the right incentives for them to go look for private finances as well in every country. That goes without saying, and this is really what we are trying to build with that common financing movement. I believe this is really the game changer here. So beyond the channels, and I'm probably not the best person to invent channels, but the promise of common financing is to go and look for those public investment institutions, to ask them to improve the quality of their funding and to give them a mandate to mobilize the private sector a lot more. Another new thing is that if those institutions are governed properly, they are non-sovereign, so they have another capacity of public of going into public debt in countries beyond the single debt of governments. So here I think we have a potential response that would be at the right scale. And another thing that I'd like to add, and because I really felt it on May 18th last, within this global architecture, we have very strong political power. Again, when we mobilize multilateralism, you reach the institutions of the countries themselves. And so thereby you create a very powerful network aligned behind multilateral priorities that have the ability to do what the Caisse des dépôts et des consignations does in France for 2 centuries now, what the KfW does in Germany. So to support, to create a dialogue, to improve the quality of public policies and investment policies in countries themselves, and in a way that no institution can do it, not even especially not the AFD. It's this architecture, this connection that we're looking for, the SDR, are a way to do this. It might not be the best way to do it, but it is at least a possibility that is available at that moment of the crisis. Thank you, Rémi.
Sorry, Masoud, did you call on me? Yes, sorry.
Yes, I did. Sorry,
No, I was still on the French translation, so I didn't catch your comment. Sorry about that. So turning to the questions on the amount and the time, I wish I could give you a clear answer on both of those, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you approximate answers, but also be able to explain why I will not be able to give precise answers to those questions. Designing a new trust in the IMF, an IMF administered trust, takes a long time because this is coming, there are so many aspects of this that we need to consider, both from the potential contributors side and from the borrowing side. So the design features to give comfort to the potential borrowers that their credit risk is protected, or at least substantially protected, is a game of constant dialogue and being able to understand where their considerations are and what our abilities are in terms of accommodating. And each contributor has a different set of constraints that they will have to consider for their domestic political processes. So we need to factor that in how we are able to design the trust, so that we are, like reserve asset status, because it's a central bank asset, we need to figure out a way. And every central bank has a different way to approach these things. How does every country budget score the risk that is associated with lending into a trust? And so this is an iterative process where we need to go back and forth with the potential contributors to understand, their limitations. What are we able to accommodate? What are we able to do? So in terms of the amounts, coming up with an amount is difficult, because the question from the potential contributor side is, how are you able to protect the credit risk? And so for us to be able to provide a mechanism where they feel comfortable, so this is a bit of an iterative process. So, all to say that, we are in that process of dialogue, and it is very hard to give away, a number at this point in time. So this is work in progress. And the timing issue also relates to the same dialogue that we are having. And just to put things in context, in the scaling up in the reforms for the PRGT that the board just approved on July 14th, very recently, the run up to it was a long time. It took, nearly a year of a significant dialogue to be able to get to the board, reach the consensus that we were able to finally get agreement on, and the board approved last, few weeks ago. So the timeline for this, PRGT is a tried and tested, well-established trust, and even reforming that took a fair amount of time. We are looking at starting from scratch here in terms of building a trust from ground up. We need to take that, in terms of a reality check on how quickly we are able to do this. One of the reasons why vaccine financing, for instance, was in the middle of, can this channeling be used for vaccine financing? And after much thought, we came to the realization that the process is so complex and time consuming that for the current pandemic, to be able to finance vaccines through creating a vaccine trust is going to be not helpful in terms of timing, because we are looking at, at least a year or more of discussions and getting the trust and the bilateral agreements that would be needed, which would need to take into account, every domestic political process in order to go through its approvals domestically takes time. So, we are not looking at anything, being ready, up and running, probably close to the end of next year, I would say would be an optimistic scenario, because there's a lot of engagement that has to go into this. But, we are putting our best effort. We know that there is a momentum. We are working with potential contributors and to understand what the demand may be and what, the potential borrowers may want to, we don't want to create the trust and have no one access it. So we need to be able to design it in a way that is attractive to potential borrowers also. So balancing all these issues is what we are into now. We are deeply involved and we are moving as quickly as we can. But the reality is there are processes that sometimes take longer than what any of us might like, but we need to work with those limitations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uma. That was super helpful. So I'm going to turn it back to Patrick to conclude for us. And I just want to say two takeaways and then one word of thanks from my side. The first one in a way is that, we're talking really about where this process is likely to come out, let's say in 18 months or 2 years' time, or in terms of thinking about the use of these recycled SDRs. And, the tension here is between gravitating towards the tried and trusted on one hand, which are relatively modest in terms of volumes and relatively limited in terms of broadening or thinking outside the box, although clearly there's some innovation that will happen. And on the other side, there's sort of recognition, as Mark was saying, I think he put it best, that we have $1 trillion, 8% of world reserves in a sharing pool. And we're saying there are huge transformation needs for the next decade to prepare the world for being more resilient to a different kind of set of risks that are now becoming so evident, whether it's climate or biodiversity or pandemics. And shouldn't we be able to use this 1 trillion more imaginatively, more creatively, in ways to make a dent in that? And then doesn't that mean that we should think outside the box? We should think about the whole system of development finance, not just the multilaterals, and we should think about ways in which we can mobilize private finance. And there are these two quite separate thoughts. And I guess the risk is that the action train will be on one side, and the other side becomes more reflection. And how do we bring the two together is the challenge, and I hope that over the next few months we'll be able to do that. So that, if you like, is my main takeaway. And I just want to spend, amongst all the people that we will thank for having helped to put it together, and obviously I want to thank Patrick and all the colleagues in Ferdi for your support, Patrick, but I also want to thank all the colleagues on the technical side and who have been important in doing it, and particularly Catherine Winkler and Claire Gasteiner, who have been our two interpreters, who have ensured that we have been able to have this seamless transition between two languages. So with that, let me turn it back to Patrick. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Massoud.
Thank you very much, Massoud. I do believe that your concluding remarks were absolutely appropriate. They are both hopeful and very realistic. I think this new initiative of reallocating SDRs, this new initiative has opened new possibilities, has created a lot of hope, but we've also seen some limitations. We have to reform the international architecture. We've talked a lot about the modalities of use. We've talked about the delays that may lead to, or the time that might be necessary for us to find a solution. But there is also a very real emergency for countries to get vaccines, to get their hands on vaccines, to kickstart the economy again in a green manner. So I guess the conclusion that I will draw from today's panel is that there is an extraordinary potential that comes with this new emission of SDRs, with this reallocation of SDRs. And we have to, of course, take into account the problems and vulnerabilities of the countries and the preference of the countries as well. But at the same time, we cannot just wait on this instrument to solve all of our problems. One of the conclusions that has appeared throughout the conversations is that when we get back to the Paris Summit declaration, the wish to better use this new issue of SDRs, this was one of the first of their recommendations, but there were a lot of other recommendations. And I think we must remember other possibilities to improve and to increase the funding to countries in order to also, I think it's important to insist on the role of development banks within countries. SDRs can help for sure, but they should not mobilize all of our attention. It was, of course, important for us to focus on them today in order to have a look at how they can be best put to use. But not everything can or will be solved by this innovation, as important as it might be. I think the consequences of those SDRs also will, it will take time for us to see them. So thank you so much, Massoud. Thank you for your support, and thank you for the great logistic support as well from CG Dev. I'd like to thank the participants as well who accepted to come and provide us, provide their expertise, their wisdom, and their vision for the future this afternoon. Thank you, Hassatou. Thank you, Uma. Thank you, Rémi. Thank you, Bruno, for your participation this afternoon. Thank you also, Mark, who has worked so hard for today's meeting and for its organization. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you and goodbye.
Au revoir.